Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Tom and Jerry, the cartoon slash live action version of Tom and Jerry. Because really, Tom and Jerry, as well as a lot of the animals in this movie, are animated, but the characters like Kayla or Terrence or Mr. DuBrose are seemingly live action. Here's the thing. We end up going along in this movie, and it kind of feels like a very like Who Framed Roger Rabbit kind of scenario, where there isn't actually at any point in any time any real like violence within this movie. It's kind of really tailored to a youth audience. Really going into this film, the thing that I did only like about this film is anything going on with actually Tom and Jerry or any of the animated like animals. I cared about absolutely nothing going on with the live action characters. Even any number of any of their stories were just something that I was just like, could I just kind of fast track through this? Could I fast forward through this because I don't care? Really, we have this entire movie built off of a hotel, which immediately I'm like, okay, so are we doing like a Dunstan checks in kind of movie? Like, are we trying to have it be that it seems that there is some kind of pest scenario? It seems that both of these, it seems like a lot of times there's a lot of hotels that they don't allow pets in these areas, and maybe you just have two stubborn animals that just won't get out. Maybe they're going to build a whole movie around that. We end up seemingly having both Tom and Jerry being both animals that are not exactly home trained. We end up having both of these characters kind of living off the land, kind of being very much homeless like cats and or mouses, and eventually going and eventually finding a home or a place to stay within this hotel for a certain period of time. We end up having within this hotel that it seems this story is on, there seems to be an entire movie carried on about a hotel wedding of sorts that people are to put on. And so here's the thing. So we end up having Chloe Grace Moretz, who is to basically be a woman that is also kind of so desperate for a job that she is to basically hook and crook her way into try to get this job to eventually go and seemingly be a front runner of this hotel, or to try to get the highest position possible. Eventually, we also have Michael Pena, who is also in this movie as well, and eventually both Kayla and Terrence, who is Michael Pena's character, kind of butt heads throughout this entire movie. We end up having also a guy from Deadpool 2, which was Rob Delaney, who plays Mr. DuBrose, who is kind of the superior out of all these people, but also it seems that he every once in a while is delivering kernels of knowledge to have this to just be recopied and pasted over to have someone say to someone else at some point in this movie. Going on into this, we end up having like this whole entire movie really centered on this wedding between this couple. And so really that's all the movie really focuses on, instead of actually focusing on either Kayla, Terrence, or like it's a whole movie about a wedding, which I was just godsmacked about. I'm like, wait a minute, shouldn't this whole entire movie have been 100% focused on the title screen characters? Like the Tom and Jerry characters, shouldn't there have been a real true focus on these two characters? But it doesn't. It seems like they keep trying to pull away from that to, I guess, try to cheapen out people by saying like, well, we didn't want to spend too much on animation, so like we're gonna have Kayla or Terrence or this wedding be a big focus, so that way we don't have to use Tom and Jerry as often, so that way we could be able to get away uh, with kind of having these characters to kind of clickbait you in this movie, because they actually are in a good portion of this film. I just feel like I'm like, shouldn't they have really like they should have, I think, built up these characters a lot better and had them used a lot more in this film. Uh, and I don't care if it's like, well, yeah, but they can't speak, they can't say anything, they can't whatever. They can sing though. They can sing. They can do a lot of like objectives and whatever to eventually get them more prominently in this movie with the whole mission that they are to put together. But yeah, so really, I would say that surprisingly enough, like I did just kind of be okay with this film. Like there wasn't a lot of time for me to go into this film and just start eye rolling or just be like, "Oh my god, this movie is going to be like utter garbage." But I just feel that like this movie wasn't bad, but I wouldn't recommend anybody to go see it. Like I feel like this movie doesn't sell you the two titled characters, the Tom and Jerry character. They really try to focus on other things to try to uh, not make a very well rounded film. If anything, I've seen all kinds of animated characters or CGI'd characters dipped into a live action movie. I've seen movies like Woody the Woodpecker, I've seen movies like Sonic, and a lot of the times a character like Woody the Woodpecker or a character like Sonic would be the most prominent character in the movie because they have the name slapped onto the film. Yeah, like this uh just feels like anything else animated wise or CGI or whatever just felt better just because it felt that one they focused on the right people, but also like for the Sonic movie and for the Woody the Woodpecker movie, I think that was a much more well-rounded movie, which I just think was better overall compared to a Tom and Jerry like film or something that has been similarly done like a Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and to a lot of that was also fairly well rounded. You could tell that this movie was trying as much as possible to be made cheaply, in all brutal honesty, especially with the way of how like really like any of the stars in this film like aren't making big budget blockbusters, and that's kind of obvious with the exclusion of maybe Michael Pena, who eventually does an Ant-Man movie, which isn't exactly like me saying like that's a big huge whatever movie. Like if anything, that's like the cheapest Marvel film that like made the least amount of Marvel money, and the sequel probably just as just as bad. So going into here, I really did find some parts of this movie enjoyable, but overall, like I was just kind of like left disappointed. But I knew I was going to be. I knew going into this movie I was going to be like cringing and rolling my eyes and just going like, God, this movie is just garbage. I was expecting this movie to be garbage, and actually uh, and actually just kind of like raised the bar of where how bad I thought this movie was going to be, and I thought it was better than I thought it was going to be. So I guess that could be a kind of a way of which to say things about this movie that it wasn't bad as I thought it was going to be, but um, I just wish there was a more better story for both Tom and Jerry. They were kind of consistently just thrusted into the story to try to keep these people on screen, or to keep these animals on screen, let's just say. So, with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. Really, I just kind of beat around the bush that basically these characters weren't used that often. That's all I said, basically. So, let's go on to spoilers about this movie. I am probably just going to rush my way through this review so I can just get it done. Uh, so we end up seemingly having it to where within this film, we end up finding out that it seems that Tom and Jerry, it seems that Tom is to be a con artist of sorts. We end up having Tom, who is seemingly being a blind cat who can play the piano, and we immediately have it to where it seems that Jerry ends up noticing that Tom is blind, and we end up having Jerry who ends up going and dancing in front of Tom, and we end up seeing that Tom is eventually noticing that Jerry is also trying to get some money, as well as Tom is trying to play. So we end up having eventually Tom trying to desperately scramble to try to get his paws on this mouse, and eventually it ends up getting it to where Jerry ends up grabbing Tom's tail, and then Tom ends up kind of hurting himself. So we end up eventually having the rest of the audience realize that it seems that Tom is not actually blind, that he's faking. And so we eventually end up having it to where uh, really eventually Tom eventually breaks his piano to where he can no longer play his keyboard anymore. So we go on to eventually have Tom, of course, now that his bargaining chip is basically done and over with. We end up having him try to go after Jerry, but eventually that is all for naught. So we eventually go on to eventually have both Tom and Jerry who are to uh, go on to not be a thing here because I really need to depress on with other people in this movie. So we end up having Kayla, who is desperate to try to find a job. So desperate, in fact, that it seems that she ends up going into this hotel to see if she can find a job. And we end up having some gal who is named Linda Perrybottom, who has this lavish resume that Linda is going to basically take from and to tell her, oh, like, you're not going to be well suited for this position. Like, if anything, like, you don't have all the right qualifications. And then eventually we end up having it to where Kayla ends up stealing the resume that Linda has and turning it in and to try to get hired for this position. And we end up having, of course, Mr. Dubrow, who's like, man, like, this resume is amazing. And we end up having it to where Terrence, who is Michael Pena, is kind of starting to name drop and to start ask Kayla, like, hey, like, I know this person from this hotel. Do you know them as well? And we end up having Kayla coming up with some silly nickname, and Terrence is like, Flatfoot? Like, no, like, that's not her name. That's not her nickname. So we end up having Kayla, who originally was wearing some like motorcycle jacket, but eventually when she goes to do this interview, she ends up getting a blazer to where she looks much more professional. So we end up having Dr. Dubrow or Mr. Dubrow, who ends up deciding to hire Kayla on the spot because she has a lavish resume. So we end up having it to where Kayla is to go on and be hired, and so we end up having it to where Kayla is being second in command to Terrence. So we end up having it to where Terrence is showing Kayla the ropes. We end up having us know that it seems that there is one guy who is named Cameron who seems to be a guy that loves to open up bottles. And so we eventually have it to where Terrence is ridiculing Cameron for consistently being a guy who just likes to open up bottles. And Kayla is like, well, hey, like, what are we celebrating kind of thing. We end up having Kayla, who is obviously into Cameron, and that easily comes obvious. So we end up seemingly having a married couple who is to come into fray, which is Ben and Mrs. Mata. And so we end up having this. Hopefully, I said that right. Probably not. Prita? Prita? Yeah, Prita? Let's go with that. So, we have Ben and Prita, let's just say. Hopefully, I said that correctly. We end up having both of them who are to go off and get married. And so, within this hotel, and it seems that there is nothing that these people, both Kayla and Terrence, won't do for this couple. So, we end up having it to where Prita is showing off her ring to all these people and show how lavish and big it is. And so we eventually have it to where it seems that Ben had gotten some bizarrish skateboard that has Wi-Fi on it, and Prita's like, "Why would somebody need Wi-Fi in a skateboard?" And Ben goes, "Well, Wi-Fi not? Wi-Fi would you not?" So it's a stupid joke. So we go on to eventually have it to where it seems that Kayla and Prita are going off to the side because Prita had lost her ring and is trying to come up with some kind of excuse to tell Ben that she has lost her ring. We end up having Kayla, who ends up mentioning to Prita and Ben that, oh yeah, we ended up taking her ring back to try to get it cleaned and to try to get it shined up, to where that's the reason why Prita does not have her ring with her. To where Prita actually said that she had lost the ring and now has to figure out a way to find it. We end up having it actually that Jerry actually does have the ring. And so we end up having also Jerry, who is to become a presence in this hotel and to eventually start to eat green olives and drink martinis and all kinds of things. We end up having Jerry looking on to we end up having Tom looking on to Jerry, seeing how lavish of a life that he's having in this hotel. And we end up having Jerry, who is to try to sneak into this hotel, whether hook by crook or whatever. So we end up having We end up having Tom, who ends up trying to get into this hotel, and eventually we end up having this fight breaking out. But of course, we end up having, Jerry, who is to, for the millionth time, outsmart Tom and to eventually get him to be shot out of this hotel, and to where Jerry could now stay into this hotel. To where he is to go and even create his own little house room. To where we eventually see that Joy the Bell Girl is to eventually notice that there's a little door there. So she ended up making little tiny towels to give to Jerry. So I guess he could go and have a shower done. So we end up having it to where uh, it seems that who we end up having it to where eventually Terrence is to eventually make a mistake which ends up costing him his job. We end up having Caleb pouncing on this job, and because of the recommendation of Prita. And so, because we end up having it to where it seems that the job of it was to try to get rid of Jerry, because it seems that Kim Jong, who is the chef, is very concerned about there being a rat around this hotel because any number of things could happen. So we end up having it to where they are to try to get rid of this mouse, and eventually Kayla decides upon herself to go and hire Tom to eventually get rid of Jerry. So we eventually have it to where Jerry just will not go. We eventually have it to where Tom is consistently trying to get Jerry and failing miserably. So we I'm gonna pause here for a second. I believe the reason why Terrence had gotten fired was because we had Terrence who was to watch over Ben and Preeta's dog, and we end up having eventually where the dog eventually gets uh, out of control and eventually goes and destroys a part of this bar because the dog is eventually chasing after Tom and Jerry, and like that whole part ensues. We end up having it to where eventually at some point in this bar scene, we end up having also Tom who is playing a piano to try to win over this other female cat. And so we end up having Tom who is now singing, I guess, as T Pain, I guess. And so we end up having it to where Tom is to go and sing this song, and we eventually have it to where eventually Jerry is kind of butting in to try to mess up these piano keys to make Tom look bad. And so eventually we end up having this chase go along, which ends up costing Terrence his job. So we eventually have it to where Kayla is now to have to orchestrate this big, huge, lavish party that Ben and Preeta are throwing for their wedding. And it seems that there are a ton of animals to be put into this wedding. There are elephants and tigers and all kinds of things. And so we eventually have Ben who is asking, like, how much bigger should he go with this wedding? How much more money that he should spend on this wedding? Thinking that I guess that is the real true thing to do. And eventually we end up having Preeta who is starting to more and more realize that Ben isn't really listening to her, and he's trying to do any single thing that seems to look cool or whatever, but is uh, just a dumb, expensive thing to get. So we end up having it to where eventually uh, we are to have this wedding go along. And so we end up having it to where Kayla is to eventually try to get Jerry out of this hotel to put everyone at ease. We end up having Tom who is to try to eventually get Jerry out of this hotel. Tom is to eventually tell Kayla that he had gotten rid of him and that he's like putting wood in front of his home. And so we end up having it to where Kayla ends up telling her boss that he had gotten rid of Jerry, and then Mr. Dubose is saying like, "Oh, okay, well, I guess we'll just have to let Tom go here pretty soon, and we'll probably just kind of give him some things of tuna to just kind of like say, hey, like, good buddy that you tried, good buddy that you got rid of this rat." So we eventually have it to where it seems that eventually both Tom and Jerry both wind up at this pet pound, uh, and so we end up having it to where eventually we end up having Terrence, who is to go and see both Tom and Jerry and try to get them out of this pound. Bizarrely, we end up having Terrence talking to both these pets in this interrogation room, which doesn't make sense to me. But we end up having Terrence mention to both Tom and Jerry that he is trying to be able to only get one of both Tom and Jerry out, so that way Terrence could have either one of them go and try to destroy this wedding. But eventually he's going to free both of them, so that way they can be able to go and ruin this wedding, which they do. So we end up having it to where eventually both Tom and Jerry are to appear at this wedding. We end up having both Ben and Preeta who are to show up in these animated elephants. And so we end up having it to where eventually there are all kinds of animals here, animated peacocks, tigers, whatever. And we end up having Preeta who is to tell Ben, like, why do we have a tiger here? And we end up having Ben saying, like, I thought it was cool. And we end up having Preeta going like, God, you're just going overboard with this, like, and you don't listen. So we eventually have it to where eventually Tom and Jerry are to show up at this place. We end up having Ken Jeong, who eventually notices that Jerry is uh, at the cake of this wedding, and so we see Ken Jeong just chopping away, trying to getting to this mouse, and eventually smack him away from this cake. We eventually see Ken Jeong just ruin this cake, trying to get to Jerry, which I thought was funny. But anyways, we eventually have Jerry, who appears right in front of Prita and Ben's elephants, where the elephants start freaking out and start dumping Ben and Prita off to the side, to where they end up getting caught or catched by people when eventually they fall off their elephants. We eventually have it to where it just seems that every single animal all of a sudden just winds up into some attack of whatever together, into some animal attacking tornado, which eventually we end up seeing earlier in the film, which Terrence is to complain about. There was some animal tornado going on. And so we end up having a re-showing of this animal tornado in this wedding, where every single animal, tiger, peacock, whatever, are all mixed into this tornado together. And so we eventually have it to where Mr. DuBose is to ridicule Kayla for how that she didn't actually take care of Jerry, and that she had let this whole thing get out of hand. To where Terrence is like, oh, well, great. Well, like, I think that I'm going to get my job back then. And we end up having Kayla, who's like, dude, like, so you were here all along to try to sabotage me, and like, I guess you just got your way. So the whole problem with this is also we end up having Prita and Ben decide to break it off. It seems like Prita just wants to go home and doesn't want anything to do with this wedding anymore. So we end up having it to where eventually Kayla is to try to get Prita and Ben back together, because it's not about her job. It's not about whatever. It's just getting these two people who are right for one another to stay with one another. So we eventually have it to where Kayla is to go on and try to have Tom and Jerry get Prita back to the hotel, for them to orchestrate how to figure out how to make the perfect wedding, and have Ben kind of make this wedding being done in Central Park instead of the actual hotel. So we go on and we have it to where eventually Kayla is to have Tom and Jerry via this high-tech skateboard try to make it to Priya, and then eventually they end up sending a drone, or Tom sends a drone for Jerry to collect Prita's cat, to be hooked through Prita's cat's teeth, to have this cat hooked to this drone, to now go back to the hotel, like have this drone fly off with this cat to go back to this hotel. And we have Prita, who is desperately trying to go after her cat and following the drone with Jerry and this cat back to the hotel. So we end up having it to where Prita is to eventually go back and to have Kayla kind of help her understand that she needs to go back with Ben. They need to get back together with one another. They're perfect for one another. And ba 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 ba. So we eventually have it to where Prita understands, and they are to eventually put on a much smaller wedding, but a wedding nonetheless. So we eventually have it to where Kayla is to go and show both Terrence and Mr. DuBose the real Linda Linda Perrybottom, and we end up having it immediately where Terrence is actually seemingly finding Linda very attractive, kind of hitting on her and whatever. And it also seems that Kayla may be working in this hotel as well, or if anything, we end up having it to where Kayla is going to eventually cement herself with Cameron and eventually kind of celebrate and pop off bottles because that seems to be what Cameron's gimmick is in this movie. He's just a guy that opens up bottles in this movie. And so we end up having both Cameron and Kayla just kind of separating their happy ending together. And really, that is just a bulk of what really happens within this movie. And so Tom and Jerry is just no, it's an okay movie, but at the end of the day, I honestly was just like, man, they really prominently use the live action characters much more so than Tom and Jerry, and I was kind of disappointed about that because I was like, well, like Tom and Jerry should have been carrying this movie, like not just been a part of it. Like really you have to like use your gimmick. Whatever your gimmick is in this movie, you should be using that 80% of the movie. Like if your movie is, let's just say, a Muppet film, like you should have the movie be 80% Muppets. If the movie is an animated cartoon cat character, whatever, being infused into live action, that character should be in 80% of the film, if not more. So with that said, yeah, I just kind of was like, meh, I don't care for the live action characters. Like, I could just kind of be okay with some of the stuff that were going on with Tom and Jerry. Some of those moments were kind of fun, especially when Tom and Jerry were kind of forced to eventually work together by the end of this film. Um, like, it was kind of like reminding me of like a Toy Story kind of scenario towards the end of this film. But with that said, I think that's all that I had to say about this film. That's all that I had to think about within this film. So I'm going to think my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.